Thank you. Okay, welcome everyone. There are still people waiting outside to get in, so we might see people trickling in throughout, but I guess we need to start anyway. Welcome to DevOps 13, and welcome to this session on Zero Effort Spring, and we're going to be talking about a bunch of things in Spring, what's new around the Spring world, and mainly about Spring Boot, which some of you may have heard of. And hopefully we can get you all excited about that. My name is Dave Syer. I'm on the slide there. If you wanted to tweet or email me, you can do that. We can talk during the session. Hopefully you'll be asking questions because this is supposed to be university. So what we're kind of hoping is that we can encourage you to get your laptops out, get online, download some stuff, and actually try it out as we speak. We'll be doing lots of demos where we have some slides to kind of keep everybody headed in the right direction. And you can see these slides online as well. If you look in Lanyard and find DevOps and find this presentation, you'll find the slides there if you wanted to follow along with them. We'll show you lots of code, lots of links, lots of things you can try yourselves. Like I said, if you want to ask questions, we can't see you at all. So you're going to have to shout. Or there's a microphone here. So if you have a question that you want to have a little conversation, or if it's a slightly longer question or something, just walk up to the microphone and wave and start speaking.
In the worst case, I think we can actually pass around a handheld mic too, right?
Yeah, probably we can do that. And we can certainly repeat the question if you can shout it loud enough. And if it's just a point for clarification or something, then that's fine. I'm sure that'll be fine. But do shout, because we can't see you. If you raise your hand, I probably won't even notice.
As part of that, by the way, hopefully you'll ask all the questions you've got here and now, but if you walk away from here with still some questions yet unanswered, please don't hesitate to carry the discussion online. We're on Twitter. There's our emails right there. We're very happy to hear from you about any of this stuff.
Well, come and talk to us. I mean, we'll be hanging around outside at least. Josh is here all week.
The booth as well.
There's a booth. There's a Pivotal booth. Maybe Josh will tell you a little bit about Pivotal when he introduces himself. So why don't you do that now?
Okay. Should I switch slides or?
Just introduce yourself first.
So hi.
Oh yeah, you've got slides for
I've
that.
got slides.
Yeah,
I've got a great slide.
Okay.
I don't have much, but I have this one slide, guys.
One slide about
So
Josh.
hi, my name is Josh Long. I'm the Spring developer advocate for what we used to call SpringSource, or now part of Pivotal. How many of you knew about Pivotal? Oh, right on.
I can see some hands.
Okay, so we'll explain that in a minute. First, just a bit about me. I'm the author of several books. I'm leading contributor of bugs to many fine Spring projects, including Spring Innovation and Spring Batch. And I'm also the guy who tried to teach Jean-Claude Van Damme about cloud computing. This is very important. Somebody has to do this, but I tried. Okay, so Pivotal, guys. Just so, I don't know how many of you were paying attention this last year. It's been a very crazy year. Spring and the Spring team moved from VMware to Pivotal, where we're now part of a larger organization, building a programmer-facing, programmer-centric stack. Spring, of course, is the component model, the glue that binds all these pieces together, including the open source Cloud Foundry platform as a service, including a Hadoop distribution, including Tomcat and Grail's leadership and the Groovy language leadership. A lot of great pieces now under one roof, all optimized for the developer, for the modern developer, solving modern developer challenges. So it's still the same Spring team, still the great same code, still Apache 2, still everything, but new company. So if you see Pivotal, that's us, okay? Come say hi. We're happy to talk to you. All you.
Okay.
What about yourself?
So about myself, yeah. What do you know about me? What have you heard about me?
This is the one and only, the illustrious, the amazing, and my esteemed colleague, the great Dr. David Syer. No, not kidding. One of the smartest guys I know. I'm happy to be here.
I'll admit that I've got a PhD.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm a member of the Spring engineering team. I've been, I guess, roughly in that role. We've changed companies, changed owners a few times, but I've been there since 2006. I've worked on Spring Batch was my project, Spring AMQ, P, Spring Integration, Spring Boot, Spring Security, a bunch of projects. So we're all kind of a big happy family, big multitasking, multifaceted happy family at Spring. So we all work on a lot of things. That's not unusual. Anyway, if you want to know about any of that stuff, ask me. Spring Boot is my latest thing. I'm kind of sharing the lead with Phil Webb, who can't be here today because he's in California. But if you have questions about that or any of those things, I'll be happy to answer them later. Okay, why don't we get started?
Please, yes.
So it was entitled Zero Effort Spring, and I kind of wrote the title before Spring Boot had its, well, it sort of existed, but it didn't really have a name at the time. This is roughly what we want to cover here today. Now, we've got quite a long time, but we're going to do lots of demos, hopefully, and we're going to hopefully get you to join in and do that yourself. I imagine there will be prizes at the booth if you can prove that you've done that.
Mm-hmm. Is that true,
Tamal?
Tamal, do we have prizes for these wonderful people?
Yes, she said yes.
I feel so neat.
Tamal is offering Josh's shirt.
This particular shirt.
This particular sweaty shirt.
Hey, it's open source, okay?
That's right. We even share our shirt. All right. Okay, so anyway, Josh is going to kick us off. He's going to talk a little bit about some more wide-ranging topics than Spring Boot itself, and get you kind of oriented, to get you up to speed with everything that's happening in Spring. So we've got to talk about Spring.io, because we kind of sketched that at the Spring 1 conference this year, and we want to show you what that means. That's kind of a roadmap, as a way of a way of understanding Spring and understanding what we want to do with it strategically, I suppose. And there's a new website which is fantastic, and I worked on that. I was on that project because it uses Spring Boot. And we're going to show you that. We're going to then switch to high demo mode and basically do lots of Spring Boot stuff. But we'll give you a quick overview of what Spring Boot is and why we're doing it. We'll do demos, we'll do stuff about configuration, we'll do what actually happens behind the scenes so you can actually understand how we've implemented it. And then one of the FAQs that I get about Spring Boot is how do you customize it, how do you extend it? So we'll have to spend some time doing that, probably after a break. There's going to be a break if you're worried about comfort. There's going to be a break halfway through this session.
10:45-ish?
Yeah, 10:45-ish is the target. We can play it by ear. If anybody wants to break earlier than that, then we can have a vote or something. All right, okay. Do you want these or do you want your other slides?
Let's do my other slides.
Yeah.
Well, actually, these
is probably a good one.
We do need this. So first things first, as part of this as part of our presence at Pivotal, it became important to have a great way of describing the Spring platform. You know, we're calling that Spring I/O. If you look at this pretty architecture diagram, we have the I/O execution layer, and that layer describes the different places where we imagine developers are going to enter the platform to start using the technologies. Right, they're vehicles to get started for different types of things. So Spring XD is our turnkey runtime appliance sort of thing for big data solutions, including those that integrate with Hadoop for dealing with online, real-time processing of large amounts of data. Spring Boot, of course, you're in the right session if you want to learn a lot more about that for rapid application development and convention over configuration-centric programming. And then, of course, Grails is our sort of full-stack web framework, that stars the Groovy language.
I think before you move on to the next section, I think the key thing for me about this layer is it's where you have an operating system process, right? It is actually executable. If you were running a process that was a Spring application, you would see these things like
in PSA,
in PS. Yeah, right.
Great point. And then, of course, once you've started using one of these different technologies, you've got the wealth of the sort of all these great technologies that are part of the Spring platform, the foundation layer, if you will. So, of course, Spring has the core dependency injection container and all those great libraries that come with it. But it's always had great support for batch processing, for web applications, for relational and non-relational data access, etc. So these are all sort of things that you can take advantage of. Some of these are cross-cutting concerns. For example, our Spring Security works very well in lots of different frameworks, lots of different parts of the foundation layer. And of course, the Spring framework underpins all of them, right? So you'll use those as you go along. Next. Anything to add?
Maybe you could just, I guess you could see from the top of the foundation layer here, so the integration batch, big data, web labels. Those are not traditional Spring labels, project labels. They're not libraries, right? They're styles of application, styles of payload that people work on. And we kind of think of things in those terms now, and you'll see that actually coming through when Josh shows you the website in a minute. A lot of the new content that we've written has been very much focused on what you do as a developer rather than, what features we support in a library. So
task-focused. Yeah, it's a great point, right? Yeah. Very important to think of it in terms of tasks trying to be solved instead of libraries. Okay.
Feedback on all this is welcome, by the way. If you don't like it, let us know. If you think it's great, we'd be even more like to hear about it.
Questions on that, actually? Just making sure we're on the same page. Okay, so, right. Here?
The next one, that one, yeah. That's
Sweet,
probably the
nectar.
best place.
So Spring has a new home on the web, guys. We previously there was springsource.org, and I think if you just go there, what does that do now? I think it just goes to.
It's just a redirect.
Right. Right. So the new home on the web for Spring, and for anybody trying to get started with this, is spring.io. Spring.io is our new portal for developers. It's your one-stop shop for all the things Spring, right, including the documentation, including the downloads and so on. One of the most ingenious parts of the new website, I think, in my humblest of opinions, is our guides, right? So we get a lot of questions from the community, and I need to learn how to click. Voila. We get a lot of questions from people in the community saying, yeah, I really like Spring. I think there's a lot of power in this technology or that, or I think we can solve this kind of problem with that. But how do we get started, right? What's the most natural way to get started and start using these technologies in earnest? And for that, we've crafted a lot of different getting started guides. First of all, these are all backed by open source GitHub repositories, but we expect that a lot of people are going to come to these guides and follow along. These are task focused, as the good doctor just mentioned. These are not specific to a specific technology. They're specific to something you might want to do. They're designed to be consumable in 10 to 15 minutes. So if you're kind of putting food in your mouth at lunch and you want to get some fuel for your belly and fuel for your mind, this is a great way to go. Each one of these guides, for example, building a RESTful service, we took the approach of no magic, no assumptions, right? So everything, and I mean everything, even the ugly stuff, is presented in the guide. You're supposed to see there's no assumptions at all, right? We expect you to be able to follow along and get from zero to a fully working application just by following these steps. We have two different GitHub repositories. There's an initial repository for the kind of like an empty blank slate that kind of helps you shortcut some of the boilerplate, like the build file, for example. But even that, you don't have to follow, you don't have to use. And then there's a complete version, a complete repository that you can use to check your work. When you follow the tutorial, you should end up with code that looks exactly like the code that's in the complete GitHub repository. These are, we highlight Gradle in the actual guides themselves, but there are Maven POMS, for example, as well. And the idea is that we're going to be using, for most of these guides, we use Spring Boot as well, right? So again, you're in the right place if you want to learn more about that. Anything to add to that?
No, it's fine. It's actually not separate repositories. It's a single repository with two projects, but
right, yeah,
detail. Fine. And there's the link, by the way, there. If you wanted to just download that now, you could
and then here's the
go
GitHub
to
repository.
github.com and go to Spring-guides.
Exactly. So that is your...
There's a copy-paste link there on the side. Yeah.
Naturally. Okay.
So anybody who's following along can do that.
Exactly. So there's the git. You can literally just git space clone space that, and you're off to the races. There are longer form tutorials, but again, and you can follow those if you want a more deep dive look at some of this stuff. But from my experience, a lot of people are just very happy to have these little, very, very easily digested getting started guides.
There are something like 50 or 60 of them at the minute, and they keep appearing.
Which is good, except for when.
And they're a community effort, by the way. They're open source. If anybody wants to contribute or wants to make edits, change the content in these, then
exactly.
GitHub pull requests. It's an open process.
And it's not. The first one I showed you was building a RESTful service, but we have data access, guides. We have messaging guides. We have integration, mobile web application development, and web application development, and obviously there's a few good ones on Spring Boot itself. And so it's just. It's sort of like a enterprise Java Wikipedia, You learn a lot just by kind of browsing through the guides, topics themselves, Okay, so yeah, definitely take note. So Spring.io, that's the new home of Spring. It's the new face of of what we're trying to do. It's a great place to get started. If you have developers who want to get started quickly, that's a great place to send them. The code itself is actually a Spring application. We actually built it using the latest and greatest Spring revision, Spring 4, Spring Boot.
Spring Boot,
And
yeah.
Yep, it's running on our open source platform as a service called Cloud Foundry, right? So Cloud Foundry is sort of like Google App Engine without the cost and lock-in, or Heroku without the suck. It's a nice technology for running your applications. Yeah, definitely a reference application. We're going to make the code itself available, open source as well, so please feel free to check that out. Okay.
Should probably just jump into Spring Boot now.
Let's do it.
Yeah. Right, so if there aren't any questions, this is what Spring Boot is supposed to do. It's a way of decluttering everything to do with Spring. So there's all these Spring projects, Spring this, Spring that, Spring the other. It starts to get a bit confusing for everyone. So one of the goals definitely is to have this single one-stop shop. There's one place where you can go to consume Spring. And personally, I think that's been very successful. I've started using it a lot. Everybody who's used it has said they'll never go back. So it will be a transformational experience. I hope you'll try it today if you haven't already. And here are the bullet points that describe, I guess, what we attempted and hopefully achieved to do with Spring Boot. So it's a single point of focus. One of the goals we had, an important goal, was to get people started as quickly as possible with Spring. So that is reflected in those guides that Josh just showed you, for instance. A lot of those, most of them are implemented using Spring Boot because that's literally the quickest way to get an application running with Spring.
We're lazy too. We want
We're
to get it done
lazy too,
as
yeah.
quick as
We've
possible
actually
as well, you know?
decided to be even more lazy with Spring Boot. It's another focus is another goal for us is to provide some non-functional requirements with things that we see people doing over and over again in projects, and that we've done ourselves. I worked on Cloud Foundry actually. I was in the Cloud Foundry team for about 2 years, and so I was on pager duty for the app that I wrote that was running in the platform and is still running in the platform. That's a good way to get some opinions quite quickly, is to be on pager duty. So the things that we added to that app are in there, non-functional requirements like being able to get a thread dump when you need to see why the thing is deadlocked and that kind of thing. Just really basic management information that you always benefit from, but it's so boilerplate, it's almost it's almost a joke. So we've just added that stuff in as a special project in Spring Boot. We'll show you that in a minute. Security is in there as well. So there are a lot of features, the useful features that are exposed by default, and I think I should clarify that statement a little bit. Somebody actually clarified it for me, so I'm going to quote him. Tobias Flora, who's an old friend of ours, a Spring Batch contributor, he immediately tweeted after he'd seen this at Spring 1, he said, he's seen what it's doing. So Spring has always been a tool for removing boilerplate code usually, like code that application developers write. Spring Boot has now stepped up and has decided to be the vehicle for removing boilerplate configuration as well. So you no longer even need to configure an application. We used to say, oh, it's just configuration, so that you don't need to worry about it when you're developing code. But actually you do, because you have to, to get started, to get actually running an application, you have to write all that configuration. Well, you don't anymore. As long as you don't mind following somebody's opinions. Okay, so we've expressed some opinions. That's what this is. It's an opportunity for Spring to be opinionated. And we can put all those opinions in roughly one place, Spring Boot, and get out of the way as quickly as possible. So if you have other opinions that you want to express, that's important for us as well. We don't want to force you to do things our way if you don't like it. We want to get out of the way as quickly as possible. So I'll definitely show you demos of doing that, and hopefully you can follow along with that. Anything on that?
As we mentioned earlier, we expect people to follow along. Wi-Fi, I guess, is devox13. Password is devox13.
Yeah, in case you didn't know.
Please connect and follow along at home.
And here's what you can do. Okay, I won't read through the slide, but if you want to try it, you need Java. Java 8 might not be the best experience at the minute, but try it and let us know if there's any problem. Java 1.6 or 1.7 should be fine. You'll need Maven for Java or Gradle. A good experience will be had if you get the Spring tool suite, but I won't force you to download that. It's quite a big download. I'll show you the features. It's just Eclipse, yeah. I'll show you the features. So if you have Eclipse, you can install it as plugins. There's a link there on the slide. Don't need to remember that because it's in this GitHub repository on the front page.
Today, actually, we released that. This is the latest
Yeah,
version.
M6 was just released at the weekend. So it says at the bottom, follow the instructions for GVM and brew. If you know what those things are, you'll be happy with that and you'll do it. If you're using brew, though, we haven't actually got the M6 version in brew in the tap yet because it's waiting for a pull request, because literally this happened yesterday. You could use M5. It will probably mostly work for most of the things we're going to do. So what that gives you, this GVM and brew thing, or the zip file, what that gives you is, optionally, you can use this. You don't have to, but it's a really nice way to get started quickly, and Josh is going to show you it in a minute. There's a Spring command line, so Spring run X, and then you'll bring up an application. This is kind of inspired by, you know, the scripty kids. Working on Cloud Foundry was an inspiration to me for this, because I actually like writing a web app in 4 lines in Ruby, right? Like, you can do it in Sinatra, and you just Ruby this file, and it just brings up a web server. That's so cool. I thought, why can't I do that with Spring? Everything is there. The programming model is nice. Why shouldn't I be able to do that? So that was one of my goals with Spring Boot. And actually, that's what Josh is going to show you next. Do you want to do that?
Yeah, this is my favorite part.
VI, or what kind of editor would you like to use?
I'll just use
gedit, yeah, okay.
So this is my favorite. I mean, I spend a lot of time bouncing around conferences, talking to amazing people like yourselves. I go to some conferences, and they're multi-discipline, multi-technologies, you know, agile and different languages and all these kinds of things. And so for me, I kind of look at that as an opportunity to get feedback, to kind of gauge response. And you've succeeded, by the way. That command line tool is exactly what you were hoping to achieve. It's more than. I love how simple this thing is. You can actually get a lot of stuff done really quickly. I showed it to people who are not just Java developers. I mean, obviously it's a win for Java developers, and you'll see that in a minute. But I showed it to people in Silicon Valley who are doing like Python or Ruby or Perl and these kinds of languages, you know, or Objective-C, and they were impressed. Even PHP programmers, I know, PHP people understood it, and they could make it work. How many of you know somebody who knew somebody once who maybe did PHP on accident in the last 20 years, 10, 15 years? They're out there, guys, and they can program kind of too, right? So this is actually very impressive for that, you know? If you can get a PHP programmer to go, yeah, I could do that, you win. Okay, so this is a groovy language script. Let's see, do we have the grab? Do you remember the ID for the grab?
You don't need that, just at rest controller.
Rest controller. So first things first, we're going to look at a, let's see here, special keyboard.
Oh, it's a UK keyboard. I'm trying to do my best to confuse Josh.
Well,
he's a Mac user. I've got a Linux PC on the on the podium here.
Hold on a minute.
It's a UK keyboard. Do you want me to just start type at for you? All right. I'm sorry.
Wait for it. Wait for it. This is going to be awesome if I can type. Controller. Okay. So this is a very simple RESTful web service. Nope, that's not so simple. That was Perl. Controller. Maybe those PHP
Anybody who's programmed in Java or Groovy should recognize roughly what the code is. Actually, while he's doing this, it only takes 2 seconds, but how many people already use Spring MVC? Quite a lot, right? So you know what this stuff is. And what he's doing is just typing the real stuff, right? The Spring stuff that does what you want it to do, just the controller, just the web layer, not having to do anything else. Even though he's a bit fat-fingered about it.
Hey. I'll make it eventually. It's a learning experience for everybody in the room, including me.
Oh, you're getting fancy.
I am. Wouldn't be Java without a little bit of fancy.
You're only making it difficult for yourself.
So, oops.
Hello. Okay, good. Now that is a fully fledged Spring application.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So let's run it. You just go back to the terminal.
Mm-hmm. So, where did I type that?
It's in the same directory there, so you can just Spring run.
So, can you guys see this? This is actually...
Yeah, that works.
Linux, I get. It's just your keyboard.
Yeah, okay.
And what was the name of the file?
App.groovy.
Thank you. So, wait for it. So what that's going to do is it's going to look at my working class there. It's going to actually kind of analyze it for based on convention, right? It's going to see that this is a Spring MVC RESTful kind of, or in this case, basic HTTP endpoint, and it's going to apply conventions. It's going to give me the class path I need. It's going to start up Tomcat. It's going to make that application available.
Bit of busy logging at the beginning because it was actually downloading snapshots of everything.
Right. Hey.
Yeah, use that one. Just type 8080. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, nothing
That's
up my
not good.
sleeves. Message.
Oh, you actually added a mapping, right. Okay, so the 400 shows you that Tomcat is running.
Did that work?
Did you add a request mapping?
Didn't I?
I wasn't reading your code. 400.
Should
Why
be.
is it a 400?
Forward slash. Path variable, string
that's
message.
fine. And the port number is 8080.
A spell, right?
Yeah,
What did I do wrong?
I don't know.
Message, whatever.
Type the spelling of path variable is message. Okay, I don't know. You're just being too clever there.
By half. Okay.
Take the path variable out.
Fair enough.
You've got a bad request because you haven't sent the right data, and then we can't actually work out by staring at it what the problem was.
Awkward.
If you named it, it might work. What I'm guessing is that you haven't tried this before. No, that's okay. Hello, Dave. Right, hello, DevOps. You haven't tried it before, and the
M6.
parameter discovery isn't working because it's groovy. But I don't know.
Yeah,
There you
right.
go. Second time it starts off a bit quicker because it didn't download everything.
Okay.
There we
So that was, despite me, an actual working RESTful web service. If I can do it, my God, anybody else in the room could definitely do it. You know, that's not bad, guys. That's literally, you could tweet that, which is, I think, a very important metric of when was Java. You know, if we had can we add the actuator?
No, let's do that next.
Oh.
So we've got some slides. Okay, getting started really quickly. This is what we actually should have done first time, just the very simplest thing. Getting started really quickly. What we've got on there is a fully fledged, I guess, RESTful, if you like. It's at REST controller is a new annotation in Spring 4, by the way, if you haven't seen it before. We can talk about Spring 4 features as we go along, and we've got some slides. We can cover them in more detail at the end if people are interested.
It's syntax sugar in a lot
It's
of ways.
syntax sugar, yeah. This REST controller just says all of the methods in this class should be at response body. So all of the methods return the HTTP response.
Do it like in Power.
Hmm?
Power.
Power. Oh, is it not plugged in? Oh, you're right, it's not. You're right to be nervous about it, but I do have a battery.
Very good.
Okay, so what actually just happened there? Well, what you didn't have to do was you didn't have to type any imports, right? So I've just added in comments up there, import REST controller and all the other stuff, right? Request mapping. Actually, those are the only two things we had to import to get this working. Then there was some dependency management, so we had to grab all of the dependencies that this needed, so Spring, MVC, Tomcat, blah-de-blah-de-blah. If you looked at the actual physical size of this app, it would be probably a WAR file of about, equivalent WAR file of about 10 megabytes, something like that. So it's got a few dependencies, and where they came from was this. So there's an @grab annotation in Groovy. It's just a feature that we're using. So we added that grab to the source code effectively to add to the syntax tree before we compiled it, and so that pulled in all the dependencies. An important feature, if you've been following Spring Boot, an important feature in M6 is that we implemented the grapes engine, the engine behind the @grab annotation. We implemented it's a new implementation that doesn't use Ivy. It uses Ether, which is what Grails uses and what Maven uses. So you get the same dependency resolution algorithms as Maven and Grails if you use Spring Boot now. So we've grabbed the annotations, we've grabbed the dependencies, I'm sorry, and then this is the first actual Spring Boot feature. We have @enable auto configuration, and that's what I was talking about 5 minutes ago about boilerplate configuration. So this is saying, okay, I just want you to configure some stuff that is normal for a web application. And so that will involve some opinions, right? So there are some opinions already baked into Spring MVC. You probably know about @enable web MVC. So we use that. We add that for you. But we also add a few other things. So a view resolver is the first thing that you have to do that that Spring out of the box doesn't have any opinions on.
For JSP and templates.
For static resources, for templates if you had them. And this one doesn't. It's just a REST controller. But
by the way, that's a great point. You just mentioned the @enable thing. Spring has always had. We don't have a lot of opinions out of the box, but you can check boxes. You can say I want WebMVC, I want batch processing, I want Facebook integration, and that usually comes in the form of @enable.
Yeah, I didn't want to say that before because it kind of diluted the message. There are already opinions in Spring, but yeah, we don't lay it all out. We still force you to express that the sort of initial assumption or something like that, like @enable WebMVC, and you've got to add something else if you want it to be a view controller. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. You still have to configure that. You still have to say I want this, and then here's the things you're going to need. Well, we remove as much of that as we can.
And we've done that by adopting some conventions, which you'll see as we move through. Actually, I don't need to spend any time on it now. So @enable auto configuration is an important mechanism. We'll be looking at it later. I'll show you what's behind it and how you can extend it. So another thing we did was, actually didn't literally change the syntax tree in this case, but we effectively wrote you a main method and created an application context, a Spring application context, using this utility helper. So there's a Spring application entry point. That's a Spring Boot feature. It's really super simple. Doesn't care if you use Java, XML, package names, whatever input you want to give it, it'll try and figure out how to make an application context and then run it. And since this one was included Tomcat, part of the auto configuration was to bring up Tomcat. Okay, so actually what I propose to do now, since there are no urgent questions,
are there questions?
Assumably, I was going to do the same thing in Java. Which I can do, and also show off some of these features of the Spring tool suite that we mentioned briefly but didn't have time to go into.
This is an Eclipse distribution. It's open source. It's a superset of the latest and greatest Eclipse download. So if you want all the features from the latest and greatest Eclipse, you can get this. And we have people on staff whose job it is to lose their hair trying to make all these plugins work together. They've already done that so that you can keep yours.
There are the guides.
What?
There are the guides, by the way.
Right.
The first thing you see when you come up. So I'm going to just create a new project. Okay, so I'll show you how easy it is. This is a relatively new feature, new Spring Starter project. I could do it the traditional way. I could do new projects. I could do new Maven projects. I could work my way up from there. But by far the quickest way now is to do this Spring Starter project or import Getting Started guide. So all those guides that were on the website, you can just import them, the complete version or the initial version into Eclipse. I'm just going to do this Spring Starter project. So I want it to be a web application. I could choose various styles here, and I can choose multiple. And then it's just take the defaults. I suppose that's going to be fine, isn't it? Don't care about that. Oh dear.
Are you on Wi-Fi?
I am on Wi-Fi.
Is it working?
It was, because you showed the website, didn't you? Let's have another look. I'll try again.
Awkward that.
The old conference Wi-Fi thing. Why did we ever rely on it? Actually, yeah, there's something missing here.
What's going on?
I don't know. I think it's going to fail again. Oh no, okay, it's working now. Whatever. So that actually it did require the internet because, and this is an interesting story, it's going to a web service in the background to download some content. It's actually going here, start.spring.io. There's a little web app that fronts the service, but it's basically the same features that you just saw in SDS. So you could use this if you wanted to, right? Or you could write your own tooling for it. I'm sure the IntelliJ guys are already doing that. So you can download a project, and the project has a test. I could run the test, but it also has an application, which is a web application. It doesn't have any endpoints at the minute, though, so I'm just going to add that stuff that...
Control-Shift-M.
There we go. It was just thinking. There we go. I think it was still downloading dependencies or something. Public string. Actually, I'm going to do it. No, I'm going to do string home turn slightly more verbose in Java than Groovy, but not much. Hello world. Hello DevOps. Again, from
Okay,
Java.
somebody else is having trouble with the UK keyboard, and it's not just me.
So this is my fingers I'm having trouble with, not the keyboard. Okay, so I can just run as Java application, but there's another feature as well in STS, run as Spring Boot app, which is just really a layer on top of Eclipse's run as, because if you run as Java application here, then it goes off and looks in the class path and tries to find all the main methods it can. Whereas actually I know that there's one there, and so that's all this one does. Run as Spring Boot app, Shift-Alt-X-B.
Rolls off the tongue.
Picks the right one. Oh dear, Tomcat failed now. Yeah, there's a really nice feature that's being shown there that I can talk about later.
What have we done?
I don't know what we've done. We've angered the demo gods.
Everything that can possibly fail on a demo will. It's a law of physics. Look it up. It's a fact. Science fact.
Yeah. Negative matches. Oh, the other one is still running.
Fair
You are so good.
Somebody drank their coffee.
Thank
Clearly
you.
not us.
Somebody
Thank
had
you.
their coffee. It wasn't us. Yeah, thank you very much. All right, there we go. Much better. Much better. Where did you open it here?
How many engineers does it take to get a website?
Hello, DevOps from Java. Thank you very much. Okay, right. So, how simple was that, right? I mean, it was made a little bit easier by the fact that I, didn't have to set up the build system, basically. So the POM that was created for me, it's a Maven build by default.
It's not that bad, actually.
We are working on Gradle versions of it. Gradle is in the getting started guides already. It's just not in this service yet. Yeah, and it's not that bad, right? I mean, it's got 2 dependencies, and one of them is test, right? So Spring Boot Starter Web. I'm going to talk about those in a little bit more detail soon, but those are basically empty jar files that just specify dependency sets, and we basically use those to say, this is our opinion. If you're building a web application, start here, right? And you're going to get, okay, what did you see? You're going to get Spring MVC, Tomcat
Jackson.
by default, Jackson, yeah, a bunch of things. So that's, roughly 10 megabytes worth of jar files there. Just
Logging.
stuff that stuff that you would have to do anyway. We've made a choice for you on logging. I'll talk about that later as well. So remind me if I forget. I'm going to stop that app now because we're not using it.
The Java config slides.
You want to do the Java config slides?
Later,
okay.
I guess. That'll work.
Yeah,
Later,
okay.
I guess. That'll work. It's fine.
How about, let me just look at the slides that we're on. How about just finishing this section?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so getting started in Java. You saw me add that at-rest controller. What just happened? Well, in Java, I guess now I'm filling in the gaps. The @enable auto configuration was the main thing that happened, and that pulled in all those, not dependencies. The dependencies had to be on the class path already. What @enable auto configuration does is creates some Spring configuration for you, and it did all the @enable web MVC in that case. Interestingly, the fact that it failed, I can't show you now because the console log is gone, but it gave you that report of what it had actually done. These are the beans that I've added. These are the beans that I decided not to add. So it gives you a nice report on why it goes wrong if it does. This is why I wanted to do this slide first.
Sure.
So the starter POMs, standard Maven POMs, define a set of dependencies that we like. There is also parent that was used here. It's optional, right? You don't have to use that. Often people won't, but it's the quickest way to get something working really quickly because it has dependency management and plugin management set up for you. So if you're using Maven, that's a good option. Gradle, as far as I know, doesn't have a corresponding concept. So if you've got any ideas about that, that's great. I'd like to hear them. I'm not a Gradler, but we do have Gradle support in the project. So there are starters for a number of things. You just saw the web one. There's one for batch integration, Spring Data, JPA, Spring Data, MongoDB, AMQP, AOP, JDBC, JMS, blah, blah, blah. There's quite a lot of them, actually.
Aligned.
They're aligned with, basically application styles, right? Yeah.
And also with, exactly. Application styles are first and foremost when you think about these things, but versions in particular. You don't spend
Yeah,
time playing whack-a-mole trying to figure out which version of which library to use with.
that's quite important. Actually, and from that, I would actually like to do something in your little app, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So, it kind of looks ugly now. But if I wanted to add a dependency here, I could grab it, and you saw the long form of the grab, with the Maven coordinates in the slide. The nice thing here is that there's a secret source in Spring Boot which recognizes all the things that we have in that Maven parent POM, by the way, are available. What should I do? Add JDBC. So if I wanted to add JDBC, I can do that. I could also just add Spring JDBC, by the way. But if I add Spring Boot Starter JDBC, I'll get a couple of extra nice things. And I'll also grab...
Actuator.
I won't do that yet. We'll cover that later. I'll grab, what's your favorite, H2? Is it called H2 database?
Yeah, com.h2 database.
I think grab H2 works. I'm going to try that.
Okay,
I'm going to
go
risk it. So let's see if it works, and I can explain why it works.
The stuff we're sure about has already failed, so the stuff we're not sure about might actually
we
work.
might just try it, yeah. Who knows? Downloading snapshots again. There we go. Doesn't seem to have a problem with that. All right, it all started up. How can I prove that it did something? That's a good question. To prove that it did something, I will auto-wire right? A data source.
Is JavaX inject supported?
Probably, but I'm not going to try it because I haven't tried it.
Enough risk.
And then I can just print. How do you print in Groovy? Like that, yeah?
I'll buy that.
Println,
sure.
probably.
And you can do system.out, right? Worst case.
All right, let's take the risk out of it. Any Groovy people in the room, tell me how to do Groovy. I should know this. That's println, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that, actually I could have shown you another feature while I was there, but I didn't. If you add -w on the command line, actually Spring run -w, it will watch the file. So if I get this wrong, I can demonstrate that feature.
Cross your fingers. I don't know, this is like a 50-year-old laptop.
It's not.
It is. It's the slowest thing you could possibly find. There are calculators that are faster. So the fact that Tomcat booted up in 2 seconds is pretty epic.
So it said hello DevOps, and there it is. There's my data source, right? So I've actually just auto-wired a data source and printed it out for you. It's a Tomcat JDBC data source because we have an opinion about that, right? We think that's the best one to use. If you don't like it, fine. You can just add a different dependency, and we'll pick that up as well, happily. If you want to ask me why that's the best data source, you can do that later.
Well, so that's the connection pool, but that wraps the H2 database.
It wraps the H2 database, yeah. So there's an H2 database running there now.
It's embedded. That means you can just start banging around with H2 and get some data access stuff working, and
yeah.
Really get something quick.
Really quickly, and especially because, and this is why I did it actually, this at grab annotation, we've enhanced it a little bit. So we compile this, right? We're using the Spring command line interface. So we can look at all these things and decide what you were trying to do. So you don't have to grab com.h2 database. Com.h2, is it just like that? Yeah. So I don't even have to know that this is, and I actually don't even know what the version number is we're using, right? I just couldn't care less. Yeah. Does anybody care what version they use? Probably not. If you do, you can put it in there. If you don't, then fine. H2 is good enough for us, right? Because we just look it up in a properties file that we've got in our CLI jar file.
Similar support for HSQL and
yeah, all the stuff that's in the Maven parent. Yeah, right. Yeah, and that will grow over time, especially as people go, "Excuse me, can I have? Excuse me, can I have that?" So we're starting with sort of basic subset of things that we like to do every day. If you find things that we haven't covered, we're happy to do it for you.
Questions on things you'd like to see? Any thoughts?
So, well, yeah, we could do that now, or we could wait until people have seen more. Why don't you do the XML to Java thing?
Oh, yeah.
Because Josh has got this evangelizing thing about Spring is not XML.
I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
He wants to make sure everybody understands that, and I understand.
Have you guys seen, how many of you are using the Java configuration? Show of hands. How many of you have seen it before in the wild? Oh, see, that means I'm not doing my job well enough. Like, really, it's a problem. a lot of people seem to suffer from this idea that, this illusion that Spring is just XML. And XML is fine. It's a great way of describing the sort of glue of your application. But there's a lot of different ways to do it, right? Spring doesn't care how you tell it about which beans you're using and which relationships they have with each other. You can use, for example, in the Groovy language has the Groovy bean builder. We have the Spring Scala project, which provides a functional Scala idiomatic way of doing it for Scala. We have, of course, Java configuration. That's what I'm going to show you here. There's a lot of different ways to do that, right? It's not just the XML. And people think, when I say Java configuration, they think I'm talking about the annotations that we've always supported, like add component and so on. Those annotations are basically a way of saying to Spring, for my component, you go ahead and infer the relationship and the structure of these beans. Go ahead and infer, just based on how these annotations and where they're placed, which beans should be created and which ones should be injected into other ones. But there's another style called Java configuration. It's been around as a separate project since 2005. It became part of the core in 2009. So it's been around for many years now. And in particular, in the last like 2 years, especially, the very large majority of the projects now support a very good Java configuration-centric approach for configuration. So I just want to do a quick primer on sort of what it looks like to take an existing Spring XML Java configuration file and then move that to Java, XML configuration, and then move that to Java configuration. When you understand the Java configuration, then you'll see, with Spring Boot, what it is to go even further and to reduce even a lot of that, So we've seen these before. These are the annotations. It's very common in Spring to create a bean, create a component, annotate it with something like @stereotype or @ repository, @component, or @service, or controller. Spring MVC's @controller. These are stereotype annotations. They're as much documentational as anything else. I mean, there are some slight differences in the way they're handled, of course. So a bean annotated with @controller in Spring MVC means make this bean, expose these beans, this bean's methods to HTTP endpoints. @component is a generic marker. It says to Spring, this bean should be registered with the Spring context, right? So we've seen that. Here's an example of a regular, typical, nonsensically boring and simple example of a bean, a Pojo bean. We've all written something like it before. It's very simple to then use dependency injection. You can use @autowired, which we've seen just a few minutes ago. @autowired is Spring's inbuilt annotation for injecting a reference to some other bean by type. You can use @qualifier in addition to say I want to inject by type and by this ID, for example, or by some other binding. We support JSR 250, which is the javax.resource annotation from Java E5. And of course, we support JSR 330, the javax.inject annotation, by far the most common annotation, I would think, across different technologies. So here I'm just injecting a reference to a Hibernate 4.2 session factory. And then you can see in my code, I've got just a basic, nothing fancy. This is something I'm sure we've all written 1,000 times before, If I want declarative transaction management, I want to enclose each method in a transaction, I can add @transactional, or I can put that on the class itself, and that wraps all these methods inside of a transactional boundary, so that anything done inside the body of that method either succeeds completely or it rolls back, right? Very, very sort of typical sort of Java. We have a caching abstraction, for example. This is another common case. People want to use memoization, right? This idea in computer science of memoization. Take, for example, factorial. Once you've computed factorial for a given number, there's no reason to recompute it. It's going to be the same every single time, right? So a very common pattern is to store the value and just look it up in a cache later on. You see this often in Hibernate. We have a second level cache there. You have the ability to look up results out of memory instead of going to the database and doing costly queries. So these annotations are very convenient. They're provided by Spring. They're there. If you want to take your application to the web, it's very simple. You just create a Spring MVC controller. These annotations help you there. But the question is, how did all that get configured? Where does it all come from, right? As I mentioned before, it doesn't really matter where it comes from. You can do it in XML. You can do it in Java configuration. You can do it in Groovy or Scala. If you're doing it in XML, you'll probably use the class path XML application context, which
We should have changed these slides this morning to use Spring Boot.
Indeed. Exactly. This is the sort of, at a minimum, even without Spring Boot, this is what it looks like. So here, basically, they're both application contexts, right? Here I'm pointing to an XML file. I'm saying, give me a bean by type, and then I'm using the bean. The same thing is possible with the annotation config application context. This, instead of taking an XML file as the descriptor, as the sort of configuration for all the application, I'm pointing to a Java configuration class. Okay, but everything else is the same. That XML, here's kind of a pretty mundane XML configuration file, right? This is, I'm sure we've all seen something like this before. Beans is the outermost element, and then of course inside you have a few different things. We're turning on declarative transaction management. We're saying, yes, I'd like Spring to help me with transactions. Checkbox, right? So you'll see this a lot. You'll see tx::annotation -driven. As often as not, you've got a, MVC::annotation driven or AOP::annotation driven. You have annotation driven, *:annotation driven all throughout the platform to turn on certain behaviors, turn on certain features.
Which is incidentally Spring being opinionated in some way.
Yeah, a little bit, right?
Quite opinionated in this case,
right.
actually. Yeah.
But you still have to kind of hold its hand. You still have to tell it which transaction manager I want to use. You still have to tell it you have to provide the transaction manager. You still have to configure everything else. So here I have a data source. Again, the database might be something you talk to in memory. It might be an actual database bound by JNDI, or something that you resolve out of the context in Cloud Foundry. It might be just a driver, a database that you're pointing to on your local machine. It's up to you. And of course, these beans reference each other. So one bean has a property, and the property can ref equals some other bean by its ID. So from the start now, let's go back to 0 and assume we've got nothing, right? So starting from just an XML document. Here's the equivalent Java configuration class. It's just a class with @configuration.
Oh, is it that? Right, yeah. Okay.
It's grayed out.
You see it's grayed out, right?
Yeah. Don't worry, we'll reintroduce these piecemeal so you can kind of see one by one. And then, going back and re-adding some of these features, some of the things that I had before. tx::annotation driven, it needs a transaction manager, right? I need to tell it how which resource I should use to manage my transactions. Spring features this platform transaction manager hierarchy. It's a way of working with transactions, the idea of batching up work, committing it if something goes wrong, rolling back. That notion, that pattern, is common across lots of different transactional resources. So JDBC, JPA, Hibernate, AMQP, JMS, yeah, sure, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Gemfile.
Gemfile, yeah, exactly. There's a Neo4j, a lot of different transactional resources out there. Spring codifies all of them in one hierarchy, so you don't have to worry about switch, and JTA, of course.
I think even Redis.
Yeah, Redis, wow.
Some NoSQL stores.
Yeah, exactly. So you'd be surprised how many different ways you can express transactions without using the same API. But with Spring, you don't have to worry about that. So you provide a transaction manager. You specify, I'm working with this kind of transactional resource. I want this kind of transaction. And then as far as you're concerned, it's just add transactional in your code. To turn that same feature on inside of a Java configuration, I just say @enable transaction management. This is the same thing. It's not literally the same thing, but it turns on the same features. It behaves almost the same way. One exception, of course, is here I don't have to specify the transaction manager by its ID. Spring can just look up the transaction manager in my context by type, right? So it's safer. It survives refactoring a lot more readily. So here I'm creating a bean method. This is the first bean that I'm defining in my application context. Spring will see this configuration class. It'll start up and invoke every method that it sees annotated with @bean. The return value becomes the class that the context keeps. The ID by default, unless you specify it in the annotation, is derived from the method name. And there's a couple of ways to reference other beans in the context. You can just invoke the method, their bean definition method, or you can declare the type of argument in the methods themselves. So txmanager might, for example, have a session factory argument instead of just calling another method. Either way, there's some, what's the charitable way of saying? There's some witchcraft and sorcery that happens behind the scenes so that scope is respected. All these things you expect from using the XML, those are still preserved. So even if I call this.session factory 1,000 times, if my bean is a singleton, I won't get 1,000 new session factories. I'll get the same one over and over. Spring actually intercepts those methods, those method calls at runtime. The other way, like I say, is to just declare the argument. So this and this are roughly the same. The preferred way, of course, for me, is probably to use that style, but if you have a bean you want to reference by type that is perhaps defined in XML, you want to mix and match, this can be a great way to get it, because you don't have a method, of course, in that case. Let's see. Oops. So here's an example of, now I'm referencing that session factory, right, in XML. We saw that before. The other thing I have back here is I have component scan. So here I'm saying, Spring, find all the beans annotated with @component or @service or @repository, @controller, or indeed any annotation that you define, right? Any annotation that you define that's also meta-annotated with @component gets swept up in this component scan sweep. I can express the same thing here in Java configuration, but again, here we have just a little bit more convenience. You can omit the base package class altogether, and it'll just find all the beans in the same package or deeper as the class on which this annotation lives. So if I'm in A.B, it'll find all beans in A.B that are annotated, A.B.C, A.B.C.E, etc. I can also specify it by type. So instead of specifying a magic string for my package structure, it works, but it's not going to be friendly if you refactor or change the package hierarchy, I can just specify a type. I can say find all the beans in the same package as this class by this type. Property placeholder resolution, another very common thing. Here I'm doing, this is sort of a kind of an interesting thing because it uses a bean factory post processor behind the scenes to actually, before the application context gets started up, to replace the values. So here I'm going to say I want to get values out of a property file, and I want to use those to configure my beans in a way that doesn't hard code magic strings in my configuration, right? I want property values to live in a property file elsewhere. So here you can see I'm using the property value ds.user in the configuration for my data source. I'm saying, get me that, resolve it from the property value out of that property file. I can do the same thing roughly with the @property_source annotation. @property_source is simply sugar, it's syntax sugar, for registering what's called a property source object. That property source is an SPI, and instead of just resolving properties from a property file, now with Spring you can register properties or read properties from anywhere you want, right? You could register a property source that reads from JNDI, from LDAP, from a database, from whatever you want, right? You could write your own provider. And once I've done that, I can use the environment object, which Spring makes available, to dereference these properties, to read the properties, like I am here. I'm saying this.environment.get property. Let's see. Finally, we saw I'm actually using the session factory. I can define that as well, no big deal. So as I showed you before, I can just call the method. And the last thing is, of course, testing, right? So you can use all these things and then more inside of the testing framework. Now let's see, I think that's it. Yep, good. Just wanted to make sure we got that out of the way. It's all you now. Okay. Any questions on Java configuration? So you can kind of see what it looks like to do Java configuration. You can kind of see what it looks like to define a regular application using Java config. And we're indeed using Java config here. It's just that, you don't see a lot of it now. Thoughts, questions, feedback? I have questions, and I was paying attention, don't you?
Never mind. I should just, before we move on, I could just say everything that you just saw on the Java config would be done by Spring Boot, except the customer service.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly.
So a lot of that was boilerplate, you might have noticed, right? I mean, how many times do you have to create a session factory? Actually, with the caveat that Spring Boot doesn't have support for Hibernate native APIs at the minute, but...
With JPA, yes.
JPA, yeah, I think most people prefer that these days anyway. Okay, so moving on with Spring Boot. We'll focus a little bit now on that Spring Application Utility class that we saw briefly on the slides and in the Java example. So it's got some convenient methods on it. So you can do Spring Application.run, which is what I was showing in the quick demo. But it also has a bunch of properties that you can set. So, for instance, you could create a new instance of it, which is what I'm doing in this example here, and then I can just say, okay, I don't want to show the banner at the top that says, I'm Spring Boot, hello.
Why would you not want to show
Why would you not want to do that? I don't know.
The greatest ASCII art ever.
Phil Webb, ASCII art extraordinaire. But there are other things you might want to set. Like, for instance, you might want to override the default setting that says, if you find Tomcat on the class path, you want to have a web application. So there might be reasons why you want to have Tomcat on the class path and not be a web application context, in which case you could do set web environment I think it's called false. So there's a bunch of properties you can set there. And the reason that we created this was, I mean, it's been an itch actually that I've been wanting to scratch for some time. Those of you who are familiar with Spring Batch and running sort of non-web applications using Spring on the command line, if you want to, build an executable jar, you can do it, but there's a lot of boilerplate code, again, that you've got to write. And Spring Batch does have a command line runner, a job command line runner, which is basically a main application that reads some Spring configuration and then interprets it as a batch job that you want to run. Well, a lot of the features of that have been, I guess, generalized into Spring applications. So you can use it to run standalone Java Spring applications, something that just builds an application context and runs it. And it might be a web app, but it might as well, just as well not be. In which case, you can do lots of customization, and we'll talk about that later in more detail. Another important feature I showed in the demo, the Java demo, was @enable auto-configuration, which is what Josh could have used in his Java config slides to basically shrink them down to one-liner. So @enable auto-configuration is something that you add to an @configuration class. So if you've got Java configuration already, then you just add this extra annotation, and that says, I want all those opinions, all right, do something for me. It's optional. Okay, so we did think about this and wondered about whether in Groovy, in the CLI case, it was done for you. You didn't have to add this annotation. It was automatic. You have to switch it off there. Here you have to switch it on. So we thought that wasn't a big cost. Everybody has to have one line of code somewhere that says you want to have all of those opinions expressed for you. So it's going to do a lot of work, basically. It's going to attempt to auto-configure your application. Actually, there's something interesting I can show you about that, which I was burbling on about earlier, but I can show you in a bit more detail now that we've got some time. So I'll need a bit more space on the screen for that. If I just add -debug there, fingers crossed. So this is since M6, or in recent snapshots, which it's obviously not doing. Yeah. All right, I'm going to do it with the Java one because I can control that more. I know that when I run this with -debug on the command line, there we go. I'm going to get this auto-configuration report. Can you see that? I don't know if I can increase the font size. Do I need to increase the font size? The detail probably doesn't matter that much. Just the fact that it's there is really interesting and useful. So you'll get that if you add. There are various ways to add that command line option, by the way. I'll show you some more later. But if you just add -debug on the command line, then it's going to give you that and some other things, but it's going to give you that report. And it's going to say, these are the things that I've done for you. These are the positive matches. I definitely found that there was a need for a message source, so I set you up a message source. If you're doing internationalization work, this is what you need, right? You need a message source. We did property placeholder configuration for you, so that was Josh's context placeholder thing. We did a dispatcher servlet for you, so we found that you were a web application. We did an embedded servlet container. We did WebMVC auto-configuration. We did a bunch of stuff. Things we didn't do, we didn't find any RabbitMQ. We didn't find any need for AOP. We didn't find any need for Spring Batch. So we did a few things negatively, right? We reacted negatively. None of those. So that's actually pretty cool, right? So in the same single annotation, @enable auto-configuration, I've got the ability to make lots of decisions at runtime based on what's on the class path, what's in the environment, what's in properties files, and lots of different ways to make those decisions. A lot of them are based on what's on the class path, but it can also be based on what's already in the application context, right? So that's relevant to this next bullet point here. If you want to change those opinions, if you want to change the behavior, let's say you didn't want that data source that you saw me injecting in the Groovy demo quickly. Well, you can just create your own @bean type data source, like in Josh's Java configuration code, and that will that will get there first. So you'll have that will be the data source, and Spring Boot will go, okay, you've already got one. I don't think I need to do that now.
Professor, how are they doing that?
How are we doing that? I might as well show you the detail now. Yeah. So there's a new feature in Spring 4. So there's a new feature in Spring 4. Anybody use Spring profiles in Spring 3, etc.? Yeah, a few people. So there's this feature in Spring since Spring 3?
3.1.
3.0, 3.1.
3.1.
3.1 was it? Okay, so you can add, in XML, you can do beans in a scope of a particular profile. In Java, it's called @profile, okay, and you give it an array of strings, and that says, @profile dev was Josh's example. That means only do this if you're in the development environment, which is defined by an environment variable spring.profiles.active. So we changed the implementation of this annotation, basically in Spring 4. It's now @conditional is a new annotation, okay, which is meta-annotating @profile.
Spring 4 due at the end of this year, by the way.
Spring 4 is in RC1 at the minute, so it's actually pretty close to being final. And Spring Boot depends on Spring 4, so we won't have a Spring Boot release. This is the next most commonly asked question about Spring Boot. When are we having a release? After Spring 4 is the answer. So this new Spring 4 feature, @conditional, is a really cool, I guess, extension or generalization of the profile mechanism. So you can make any bean definition or any @configuration, any method in that bean method in an @configuration, @conditional on something, okay? And then the condition is expressed through a condition interface. So there's a profile condition, which is the special implementation here. And if I was to look at the implementations I've got of conditions, you will see that most of them come from Spring Boot at the minute. So there's a profile condition that's in the core Spring framework, and then the Spring Boot condition, which is a base class for all of these things. Databases, embedded databases, Tomcat databases, on bean, so is there already a bean of this type or this name? On class, is there already a class of this type on the class path? That one's used a lot. On expression, if you have a spell expression you want to look at, is this system property set or not, usually is what that's for. On resources, does this resource exist? So is there a SQL script, for instance, in this location? You could use that. And then there's a special on web application condition and various other implementations that are, private and nested and not on the class part of this project. So those are just the ones that we use by this demo, obviously. So Spring Boot is kind of a breeding ground for @conditional, and a lot of that stuff will probably move into Spring Core in, let's say, 4.1 or something like that, because it's generic, but we've been able to develop it much faster in Spring Boot, so that's where we're doing it. So the answer to what's really happening behind the scenes there is mostly to do with @conditional, mostly.
Conditionally defining beans.
Conditionally defining beans and whole configuration classes.
And you can do that too, by the way. You could say, if the NASDAQ crosses 1600, this bean gets to live, anything you want.
You could do that.
I wouldn't. Or maybe I would.
I don't know how useful that would be, but you could do that. Yeah, so often it's conditional on class or conditional on missing bean. That's how we do the back off as you define your own. Okay, so if you introduce Spring JMS onto the class path, then you're going to get a JMS connection factory. Actually, you only get that if you've also got ActiveMQ at the minute, because there's only one way to do that out of the box for a standalone app. But anyway, so there are things that we look at in the environment to decide what to configure for you. And then, actually, the thing I didn't quite show you in the demo, but I can show you now, there's some convenient stuff. In addition to the parent POM that I did show you that just gives you dependency management starting points. There should be a demo here, yeah. So this is my Java demo. Right, Maven project. If I do Maven package, it will be a good citizen, run the tests, succeed, and then at the end I've got a jar file there, demo snapshot jar. I've also got demo jar original, okay, so that means that the original jar that was packaged by the Maven jar plugin was enhanced and made bigger, ls-l target demo star will give you an idea. So it went from just the code in the application was 2 kilobytes. It went up to, this is pretty typical, right? So that's 9 megabytes for a web application, including Spring MVC and Tomcat. Everything you need to run the thing is there. And now this jar file is executable.
Finally, we have the same approach for batch processing as well as for web applications. Oh, yeah.
I was running in the background. There we go.
So the biggest bug we've had so far
is running the server in the background. There's the auto configuration report and the application's running. So it's executable. There is similar support using Gradle. So if you like to use Gradle instead of Maven, we have a Gradle plugin that does the same thing. I'll talk about the technical details of that a bit more later on. It's optional, right? You don't have to do things that way. If you want to build a WAR file, you can build a WAR file. If you want to use an existing executable jar mechanism like a Maven Shade plugin or something, you can do that. We think ours is better. I can explain why later. But there's some plugin support there for packaging for production. And personally, I think this is a really nice style for building applications, any kind of application, right? It's not just toys for demos. And the same thing goes for the Groovy CLI, actually. I mean, that's a nice tool for packaging for production as well. This is great, right? I mean, you can just take a single executable jar file and just, give it to anybody who wants to run it. It's much easier than saying, clone a project from GitHub, download Maven, download Java, run the build,
hope it all works.
File, download Tomcat, run Tomcat.
Sacrifice the goat.
All of that stuff, yeah. So it's a great way to get stuff up and running as quick as possible, especially, and this is another thing I got from my Cloud Foundry days, people who don't know Java that well just don't get why it's so complicated, right? If you can just give them a single file and say, run this, then it's much easier for them as well. And that, that goes for a lot of people in this world.
And even those of us who do know Java.
And they find it easier.
Don't like wasting our time,
Actually, yeah.
Don't like wasting our time,
Actually, yeah, I mean, a personal story on that, a bit of background. So I found that I've been doing this now since I started Spring Boot. I've been doing this kind of main method, Spring application.run. I've been doing it, daily, even for production apps, right? I worked on that Spring IO website. This is how that's run. It feels really natural. As a developer, you just, you have a file, you just run it. It feels great, and I can do that in the IDE really quickly, right? There's no messing around.
And speaking of Cloud Foundry, you can do CF push for a Spring Boot application.
I wasn't even going to demo that, but I suppose we could do that later if we've got time. Yes, so the Cloud Foundry Java build pack. Ben Hale, maybe in the room, I don't know, he's speaking later on this week. Go to his talk if you go to nothing else at DevOps. It's the
and
best.
The BOF.
And Josh's BOF tonight on Spring. Yeah, that's tonight. We can talk about that later. But Ben's giving a talk about RESTful APIs using Spring later on, but actually more about how to design a RESTful API. Not really much about Spring, more about what are resources. So go to Ben's talk. Anyway, Ben's responsible for the Java build pack in Cloud Foundry. So if you run a Java application in Cloud Foundry, this is the sort of glue code that works out that it's a Java app, gets the JRE, creates the process. And it has some awareness now of Spring Boot and this kind of application. So in particular, it will recognize this kind of jar file, right? It'll recognize that thing has Spring Boot launchers in it and just use those. So deploying a Spring Boot application to Cloud Foundry is as easy as CF push minus target, minus path. I was getting that wrong. Demo jar. Okay, so that would push it up to Cloud Foundry. I'll demo that later if I've got time. If anybody's interested, if you're not, then...
Deploying an application today doesn't require, because I remember like 10 years ago when sort of Java EE was starting to get terrible, they talked about, I remember reading the documentation, and they used to say that in order to do a Java EE app, you had to have 7 different roles, the deployer, the packager, and I just can't imagine having 7 different people working on the same app whose sole function in life was to manage the process, the deployment, and all that stuff. Now it's just Java jar, and if you want to get it running in a production environment like a cloud, CF push, it's brave new world.
And for those of you who are asking about WAR files, I know that you will. We do support that as well. You just have to have a different entry point to You need a servlet 3 servlet initializer to create the app instead of a main method. But you can actually have an executable WAR file, right? So you can Java-Java WAR file, or you can give the WAR file to Tomcat, WebLogic, etc., and they will run it. I think we've got a break now. If anybody wants to come down and ask questions right now, we'll be offline for like 15 minutes. So go off and have a comfort break if you want. Come back in 10, 15 minutes.
Before you go, can you guys smile and say open source?
Carrots.
Oh, strike a pose. So sexy. Right on. Thanks, guys.
All right.